Margaret Heffernan. I'm a professor of practice here at the University of Bath School of Management. I've led 5 businesses, that's the practice part, and I write books and articles about how business works, or sometimes how it doesn't work. I'm really delighted to be here today with 3 really amazing people. All of them have had unusual and intriguing careers in finance. All of them huge supporters of women, and all want to see women in finance thrive together. In the UK, the number of women in finance is rising, but that's from a very low base. The very volatility in the sector makes it hard to get accurate numbers. While the big banking institutions have been measuring gender equality for a long time, new kinds of firms, from venture capital to private equity to digital finance to cryptocurrency, are really hard to pin down. In terms of those approved to work in finance by the Financial Conduct Authority, only about 17% of individuals are female, and that number has scarcely changed since 2005. This despite a mountain of evidence that diversity improves decision-making, that it makes companies more reflective and connected to the markets that they serve, and some evidence that shows women generate better returns. Progress is slow. But rather than gnash our teeth and wail, which is something I've been doing for at least 20 years now, what I want us to do today, because I think it might be significantly more productive, is to explore where are the opportunities, the really interesting opportunities for women in finance. After all, there is a very great deal more to the financial services sector than just the famous bits, which are trading, mergers and acquisitions, and accounting. So where is the really interesting work to be found? Are there advantages to being female? And if so, what might those be? And what is it that really helps women make it to positions of influence and power? So my first guest today is Jane Ellis-Brush, who, as far as I can tell, frankly, is afraid of nothing. She started her career in construction, a male-dominated field, if there ever was one. Not content with that, she moved into supply chain and spent the last 10 years working in Citibank as a managing director. We are phenomenally lucky that she's now come back to us at the University of Bath as a senior lecturer in information decisions and operations. So, Jane, welcome.
Hi, Margaret.
Rather brutal first question. What do you think has made you so fearless? When we talked about your career, you didn't strike me as someone who felt deep levels of timidity.
I've always been regarded as very tenacious. I don't really quit when I find things tough. That being said, I've not always found it easy in the career I've had, but I kind of find being told I can't do something makes me stronger.
Yes.
And I'm quite obstinate about that. So it's been all the way through my career. I just am dogmatic and I push and I ask why not, and it seems to work for me. It doesn't mean I'm always confident, but I'm good at I guess portraying that. I think that's really important to sort of give a good impression, look good and feel good. So it's probably one of my mantras.
Right. And so what led you to start in construction?
Well, it was just an opportunity came up. I'd already been working in supply chain for some time, and the role came up as a supply chain director of a UK construction company. And I hadn't tried that sector, and I'd worked in a few other sectors beforehand, and it was probably my first very senior level role, looking after a large construction organisation across the UK in many different regions and different organisations. So there'd been lots of mergers. There was a diverse team. I had to start from scratch, building capability, and I really enjoyed it. And it was also, the company was growing, so it was a very exciting company to be in. It was different every day practically, and it was just about learning by doing, really. I even managed the fleets of vehicles for a period of time on my own, so got my hands dirty.
But I think you made a point which I think is really interesting, which is the role was starting from scratch. And one of the things I found in myself and in the careers of many women that I've talked to is that entering a new role often gives you a lot more scope to shape it for yourself than walking into a role that has typically been done by men. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do think that seems to be a common factor for me. A lot of the time is a lot of the roles I've come into have had a lot of transformation within them. I don't think I've ever taken a role on where there hasn't been transformation as part of it, which does give you the opportunity to create the scope and be flexible. And I think you need to be creative, you need to push. You don't wait to be asked would be my thing. Come up with a strategy, come up with some ideas. And be really creative about it. And people are normally really excited if you're offering to do things and offering to be helpful, which, I've always put my hand up for extra work. I've quite often taken on double roles. I've offered to double hat. I treble hatted in my last job. So it's something that I like doing. I'm full of energy. And the more I do, the more energy I get, I think. So.
Yeah. But it's also great if you enter a role where nobody can say, oh, we don't do that job that way. If there's a blank sheet of paper, it's really up to you to design what it is and how it gets done.
Yeah, and I think even if you're in a role that's been there for a while, there are ways of making it better, ways of improving it, making it more efficient, finding efficiencies, and actually also delegating a lot of work, giving it to people to help them progress as well. I think that's important to make sure other people shine.
Yeah. So then why the shift to financial services?
Got headhunted. It seemed like a really good job. I hadn't been in financial services. It was an area that I didn't think I was going to enjoy. I had visions of lots of male investment bankers, and they would be the last people I wanted to talk to. So, but saying that, I joined Citi and found it was an amazing organisation. I worked in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, so my team were very diverse. I had 200 people across 55 countries. So.
Wow.
It meant, it was actually really interesting for me to sort of work with a team. I did extensive travel, came up with a whole new load of strategies. So, I started from there and then progressed to doing a lot more stuff as time went on.
Right. I think people often forget that inside financial services is a whole complex series of operations that need to work well and they need to work fast. So much of this has undergone so much transformation, even in the last 5 years. How broad do you think that range of opportunities is now?
Oh, I think the infrastructure that supports the banks are huge. So, I was working in shared services. I was running a service centre in Budapest for quite a long time. So we had 2,000 employees there that I looked after, and so really big, significant back office functions, the finance function, procurement function, accounts payable, all the client services stuff. So massive potential for people to do operations and do some important, behind the scenes work. But you still have to interface with bankers. You still have to get things signed off. You're doing a lot of strategy, so it's still very exciting. Still lots of cut and thrust and lots of pressure.
Yeah. One of the things I was wondering is, a lot of what you were doing in your role at that time was really, as you said, it's back office, it's infrastructure and so on. And this is in an industry where certainly all the notoriety and power seems to derive from deal making. Right? Mm-hmm. So how far do you think that kind of infrastructure work, how far is that a sort of second-class activity, according to in relation to closing huge deals with gigantic upsides?
Well, you're certainly. I always felt a little bit like a second-class citizen quite often. So, whether people would take you seriously or not, but without those functions, banks can't exist. And certainly, with all the new regulations that came in, we became more and more important. It couldn't just do the deals without that massive infrastructure behind, without the governance and the support. So, it might not be very glamorous, but we were a necessary evil probably from their point of view, and just made it work. So it wasn't. I did definitely feel like a second-class citizen sometimes, and certainly, I think I said to you, I sometimes felt like I was there just to make the tea, because I was quite often the only woman in the room, and it would be a while to say, no, I'm not here to make the tea. I am actually representing my function here. So, some of those were a bit of a challenging attitudes that you have to push against, really.
Yeah. Well, also it struck me, that a lot of your roles about saving money, whereas the financial services really worships the people who make the money.
Yeah, and I joined at a time when just the financial crisis had just happened, and I was in charge of expense management as well for Europe, Middle East and Africa. So having to have conversations with senior people about, do you mind traveling economy? Or no, I'm not going to pay for that lunch. You're going to have to pay for that yourself or claim it through expenses. And by the way, there's a limit. I think that, I wasn't always that popular in the early days because that was a real focus for the bank. So it was a difficult conversation to have.
The other reputation, of course, that financial services often has is that you are really working 24/7. And if you want to have a life, forget about it. Is that well deserved?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think I'm not going to say it's not. I think there is more flexibility if you're doing back office, but you're still expected to be on call. And, if there's a conference call at 10 o'clock at night, you join it. And especially with an American bank where the head office is in an American bank, I had to join conference calls at ridiculous times. And if I was traveling, I would have calls with my team at 3 o'clock in the morning from the US to make sure that everything was working back in Budapest. So it tended to be, quite a lot of burning the candle at both ends. But, I enjoyed it and thrived on it at that time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, clearly, even talking about it, it's clear how enthusiastic you were about it. So what is it that made it so exciting?
For me, it was the people, watching teams being able to develop. I'm very proud to say, and I got questioned for it a number of times. I had a large contingent of senior women in my team. Had very few men. I was told at one point it was slightly imbalanced and I should think about recruiting a few more men. But I had some great women working for me, and they have gone from strength to strength, and it was great to see people come up through the ranks and develop really well. So the people I love people, and I really enjoyed working with people who wanted to do more and were willing to step up and do an extra mile to to get something done.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you and I talked about that I thought was really interesting was, how much effort you put into, hiring, developing women and so on. And you're continuing to do that, even though you're no longer obviously in financial services, with your charity First Impressions. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, it came out of a rather embarrassing episode where all my clothes from my Budapest apartment got delivered to my 2-bedroom rented flat that my husband and I had got in Bath, and the clothes just kept coming in, and I actually had nowhere to put them. And actually, from that point of view, decided it would be a good idea to give them to somebody else, because I've always found that wearing particular outfits or particular garments make me feel good, make me feel confident. And actually, quite a lot of women don't ever get that opportunity. It may not be a suit, but they may not have access to the sort of workwear that enables them to just feel a little bit more confident. Almost, we're trying to provide the last mile, I guess, in terms of getting people into work who are in difficult situations. So we've set up the charity, and we're looking for clients, and we have quite a lot of organisations we're working with. We're currently collecting clothes. We're sort of starting to help women. And it's getting really exciting. It's starting to get busy. I'm getting a lot of organisations who are interested. We're still lacking storage space, so if anyone on this call has a nice room they'd like to offer me for First Impressions, I'd be very grateful. But yeah, it's great, and it's nice to see even our first client was so happy that we've been able to help her, and she's gone on to start working in a job, and she feels a lot better because of the clothes that we were able to give her. So it's a nice thing to be able to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do please, as you're listening, feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box. We will be coming to those later in our session. Thanks, Jane. I'm going to move now to Ali Khazimi. Ali now runs his own advisory business, a kind of miniature PwC, he likes to call it. But before that, he's been all over financial services, starting in what was Coopers and Lybrand, then moving to Deloitte's, and then to BlackRock's, where he was head of tax. Ali is a huge champion of women, and he has a real understanding of what discrimination can look and feel like. When he joined a cohort of 800 students at Cooper and Lybrand, he said the chances of a non-Oxbridge graduate of Asian descent joining such a firm were virtually nil. And Ali, although we've heard a great deal about how tough financial services were on women, it hasn't always been a particularly easy place for Asian men either, has it?
No, it hasn't. But I think I was talking to a friend of mine, a black lady, and she was saying to me that, you know, there's the difference between black women find it much easier than black men in corporate world. That's not the case with Asian men. Asian men have had it easy, but I think it's particularly difficult for Asian women. And you know, if one reads the press over the weekend, you know, it was quite interesting. This new label, which I hadn't come across, this idea that you can, you know, your Muslimness can keep you back. So, you know, I think there is a real genuine issue, which is to do with diversity, particularly for Muslim women. And what you find is that quite often, and this experience isn't anything new, I'm sure people around the table will agree with this, is, you know, it's that discounting that goes with it, where, you know, quite often you're either told it's imaginary or that it's okay, you know, to be Islamophobic or to, you know, best person for the job. Well, you know, what do you mean by that? What, 50% of the population can't do this work? So, you know, the excuses are there. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, we've just had it, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. Up until the Me Too movement, it was quite interesting. Before I came online, I was just looking, you know, how many people, senior financial executives, had been removed for sexist behavior. Would you believe, up until the Me Too movement, there were none.
Wow.
And straight after that, you know, I was a partner at Deloitte. I mean, 10 partners were essentially asked to part way with the firm because it became completely untenable. And, you know, I'm sure they probably went under, the lawyers came in, there were gag orders and things like that. And in the past, it was always easy for women to exit rather than the perpetrator. So I think there are some real genuine challenges. And, you know, I see it as alliance, whether it's Black, Asian, Muslims, or whoever you are, you know, red, orange, pink, it doesn't really matter. Discrimination is discrimination. And, you know, those of us who have felt, you know, left out, you're not asking for something over and above. Right. We don't want special favors. All that is being asked is treat us fairly. Yeah. Okay. And it's just simple, something as simple as that. When you don't get that, when you get the closed clubs and the networks, when they're systematically working against you. There's so many times I hear about, oh, it's not systematic racism. Of course it is systematic racism. You know, so yeah, I'm really, really am passionate about it, and it has been tough, but you know, the fact that I did make it, you know, partnership in various firms and things like that, to me, that's a signal that things have changed. Have they changed fast enough? No. And as I've just pointed out, I think sort of like there is a real challenge around Islamophobia generally, but particularly when it comes to women, Muslim women. You know, we talked about the discounting, but, you know, this idea that somehow there's Muslimness, so females are expected to be submissive, they do not have a voice, they don't have an opinion, but just categorically just put a whole bunch of people in that, label them fitting into that category. I think there's a real problem.
Yeah. It's really interesting. You remind me of a time I was running tech companies in the States, and my company had been invested in by a very successful investor, and he had probably a portfolio of about 40 companies. And of these, the CEOs, I was the only female CEO of the 40. And there was one Black CEO and one gay CEO. And strangely enough, the three of us became great pals. And we really bent over backwards to try to do business together. Because on some level, we felt we had a sort of similar experience, which was we were sort of outsiders at the table. And I think, you know, you make a really interesting point that there's an opportunity, and I think a really important opportunity, for anyone who's had any experience of this kind of discrimination to make common cause with others, no matter which outgroup they belong to. And in some ways, the more that happens, the better.
It was interesting what Jane was saying, and I could see so much of it as applying to me as well, just for that same reason. And you asked about what keeps you going, and for a lot of the time, because it becomes ingrained, I would always be doubting myself, and you're going through this imposter syndrome. And one of the things that kept me going is because I always felt that I was flying the flag for other people. So, you're almost an accidental hero. It's not because of you deserve to be there. I'm here, but, finding that motivation, especially when it does get tough, when you are being marginalized, when you do see the injustice, you work and you have to work extra hard in order to, all of that is tough, but you just sort of like saying is, if I quit now, I would have, there's all these hopes and expectations that go with you. Yeah.
Yeah. And yet clearly quite a lot of, as it were, outgroups, minorities flock to financial services because, of course, an accounting qualification is a really objective source of validation, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is, once you do have the qualification, you can actually rely on it. But the profession is still very closed. So I completely agree with you that in some ways it disappears. The issue of your, I was referring to an imposter syndrome. If you're qualified, you're qualified. It doesn't matter whether whether you're male, female, and so on. That issue of ability just goes away. But nonetheless, what I would say, the socialization processes, they are there, and they do work against sort of like minority and gender sort of like along the lines.
And some of this, I think I'm right in saying, you experienced in terms of a sort of drinking culture, which for a Muslim must have been pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't do it now. We run a Sharia compliant firm now, but in the early days, I mean, just in order to be part of the crowd, I mean, so many times I would just order tonic water so it looked like alcohol and be sipping away at it. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the challenges. Is quite interesting. We had recently, the English cricketer at Yorkshire Cricket Club, and you just have to put up, and so many of the times, I mean, things that just wouldn't be said now were just part and parcel of it. I mean, it applies to me. You talk about the finance culture. I mean, things being on the trading floor. I mean, the language that women were being subjected to, if they made it to the trading floor, it was only one step up from a building site, basically.
Right, which Jane can tell us all about, presumably, right? Yeah. So as financial services have become more and more complex, and there are different kinds of incarnations, has the rise of things like hedge funds and private equity made a difference, do you think? Are these kind of new sorts of businesses open to new sorts of ways of working?
I sense that, absolutely. I think there is a greater degree of, when you moved away from the large institutional businesses towards these more boutique type of settings, it is allowing a greater expression. And I think there's a younger generation that's coming through who are just not, I mean, it is really impressive. Recently, I'm not sure if you saw that article in Bloomberg about BlackRock let go of one of this firm called Flow Traders. They basically said, you're not going to be, part of our ETF product program any longer. And it was because something was said to a BlackRock employee that was basically not right. It's not to say that BlackRock hasn't had its own troubles. I mean, 2016, there were sort of like, claims, systematically was investigated, that bring in external counsel. But the point, it's changing. And I think there is a voice, there is a strength, there is confidence, and it's really good to see that. And the more we talk about it, it's great. I mean, today's webinar is one such example. It's great that we're talking about this.
Yeah, yeah. But it's also very interesting to see a kind of leader in the field like BlackRock taking these kinds of issues as seriously as they do, because that sends a signal to the industry as
Absolutely.
a whole, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with all those challenges which you experienced, what remained the allure of financial services for you?
I'm a bit of a techie. So to me, people might think that tax is really boring, but actually, if you do financial services tax, it is the most interesting thing, because what happens is the actual subject matter. I mean, you talk about sort of like the emergence of hedge funds, the private equity sector. The hedge funds are changing as well. So, I was on a call just now earlier on in the day. We were talking about cyber hedge funds. So who basically go into invest in fintech companies and things like that. Hedge funds have had, they're basically going into shipping assets. So all sorts of like weird and wonderful things that are happening. So the subject matter, the widgets keep changing, but so does the tax on top of them. So it's a really it's very difficult to get bored, basically. It's like what Jane was saying, sort of like, in the past, people haven't always appreciated the back office, the advisors, but actually we play a more and more important, increasing role.
Right.
As the legislation, the regulations become more complex, there is a greater need.
Yeah.
And actually that's part of the liberation point that you're talking about. Once you have the expertise, the color and my having a strange sounding name doesn't really matter, because if someone wants securities lending advice, they will come to you.
Right. Nevertheless, you did decide to break away and to create your own firm. So what led you to do that?
I think it's, that liberation whereby you do have the confidence, having done this for so long, where you think, I will use the financial services jargon, which is, you've done the beta, now I'm searching for the alpha, because it was easy when you've got a big name like EY or Deloitte over your head. Of course, you're bound to win assignments, but now you're basically really testing the strength of the alpha, basically saying, can I stand on my own? Are people willing to sort of like commit because they see the expertise? So it's thoroughly satisfying. And importantly about some of the practices, the people side of things, it's that investment. If you get a buzz, you don't want to be inhibited by Uber structures. You want the freedom to be able to go and do things. And sometimes you do things which challenge industry norms. And it's great. It's terribly liberating.
So
I'm sure, Margaret, you will talk about your experiences as an entrepreneur.
Well, I think one of the great things, that's so interesting about entrepreneurs is that, the mythology around them is everybody's in it for the money, or everybody's in it for the glory. But actually the reality of it is people go into their own businesses really to see what they're made of.
Absolutely.
It's a fantastic kind of journey of discovery, and unbelievably scary, unbelievably gratifying, and everything in between.
Yeah, it's not for the money. Absolutely not. I think it's that, you're absolutely right. It's the galvanizing.
Yeah.
It really, you've had X number of years where you work other people's ideas, and you sort of like saying I think I've got something really useful to take to the world. And I think that's really, as you're saying, terribly gratifying.
Yeah. And how will you know how good it is unless you give it a shot?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ali. And last but very much not least, it's my huge pleasure to introduce Johanna Barr. Johanna came here to the University of Bath determined to focus her learning on finance as much as humanly possible. She had a pretty good idea what she wanted to do. A placement at PwC, another one at Deutsche Bank, led to a position at Deutsche Bank in M&A and corporate broking. In 2007, she read a job ad in the FT, right? Those were the days. And she says she sort of stumbled into private equity and into investor relations, roles that were fairly new, in an industry that was really just coming into the limelight. Johanna, welcome. I wonder if we could kick off by talking about what private equity actually is. I suspect a lot of people have heard about it. They'll almost certainly have opinions about it without quite knowing necessarily what it is or what it does. So what is this magical world of PE?
Thank you, Margaret, first of all, for having me, and thank you to the fellow panelists for some interesting commentary already. So private equity, I'll try to keep it simple. As an industry, we buy companies, mostly privately held companies. Oftentimes, it could also be in the form of a public to private, across different sectors, across different sizes. And we look to grow those businesses under our ownership, invest in them, grow earnings, make them more valuable. And you usually try to sell them after a period of 4 to 5 years with a view of making a healthy gain for our underlying stakeholders. Sort of the return targets for private equity are usually that we try to double the money for our investors. So if we invest $100 in a company, we hope to sell it for between $200 and $250. So that's a simplified model. In terms of the investor base, I think that's really important. Where does that money come from? You might be surprised to hear that it might come from a lot of the own pockets of listeners on this call, because our investors are everything from US state pension funds, insurance companies, you have sovereign wealth funds. So you're potentially part of your pension, if you're a teacher in the US or a firefighter in a US state, might actually be invested in private equity. And so the stakeholder base is pretty wide. And so it's deemed a risky investment class because obviously the return profile is pretty highly targeted, but it also it's illiquid. So given we invest money in companies for at least 4 to 5 years, if you invest in a private equity fund, you know that you can't just call up the next day if you need some cash and want your money back. So the money is pretty tied up for a long period of time, and hence it's an asset class that demands a certain risk premium and risk return premium as a result of that.
Right. And at Advent, your role is described as managing director and global co-head of limited partner services.
Yes.
But your job's in investor relations, which in PE is a whole different job, really, than the role that, say, investor relations plays in large corporations. So what is really at the heart of the work that you do day after day?
Sure. Private equity firms, a technical term for a private equity firm is also a general partner. The investors are limited partners because they have limited influence and limited liability in terms of their involvement in the day-to-day business. They provide the funds, and we have fiduciary duty to invest those in a sensible way. What my role day-to-day is to ensure that our investor base is aware of what we do with their funds. We give them regular updates around the companies we invest in, give them updates around the valuation of the underlying portfolio. They may want to know about, right now we're getting a lot of questions about inflation and what are we seeing in the portfolio. We get a lot of questions about diversity, equity and inclusion, how we're managing that within Advent, how we're managing that across the portfolio. Around the time of COVID, we get a lot of questions about what percentage of the portfolio companies are affected by COVID, what's the exposure in Asia initially, what are the knock-on effects to various issues around the globe. So it's investors just want to be updated around what's happening to their investment, and that's kind of the main function. And then on a periodic basis, usually between every 3 and 5 years, we would go back to investors to ask for a recommitment to a new fund that we're raising. It's worth saying that different to hedge funds, investors might commit, let's say, 100 million to us over a period of a fund cycle. They don't wire us the 100 million on day one. It's a legal agreement, and that means that every time we draw down the fund, we make new investments, we might send them a capital call notice for 10% of their commitment, which then gets wired, which then gets immediately invested into the company that we've lined up. So that's kind of how the model works. And so they need to be kept updated what we're doing. And obviously it's in our interest to be as transparent as we can be with our investors, because we'll be knocking on their door in 3 or 4 years' time to ask for a recommitment to the strategy and to invest in new companies.
Mm-hmm. And how far at Advent are you focused on investing in particular sectors or with a particular strategy in mind? Or how far is it simply a very broad portfolio?
We're extremely sector focused, but we have a very large team. So, we have over 200 investment professionals. We cover 5 sectors. You could argue we have sort of 5 global sector funds investing in parallel. We have anywhere between 30 and 40 people that are really dedicated to one sector, and that's kind of all they do. They wake up in the morning, try to find a good deal in the European tech space, and that's kind of their main focus area. And I think the reason it's important these days to be extremely sector focused, and we're certainly not the only ones, is that to my initial comment about being able to grow a business and help them transform, maybe from a business that might just be on the east coast of the US, making them US wide, or a business that's just in the UK, but has an offering that might be interesting for continental Europe. To be able to grow that, you need really expertise in your sector. And so the more expertise we can bring to the table and the more repeat knowledge we have from an old deal we might have done, the more likely is that we create a successful outcome for the companies that we own.
Right. Now, I know that PE gets a lot of negative press. It's often accused of asset stripping companies, piling them with debt. But I also know that isn't the whole story. There's a lot that PE can do, which other kinds of financial institutions really can't. Can you explain what you think really makes PE a kind of crucial part of the financial system?
Yeah, I look for me, private equity is ultimately, there to support businesses and to fulfill their growth potential. And oftentimes it can be something that is not possible for under current ownership. So that might be under current private ownership. It might be a founder that has taken it to a certain level, but there's now an investment required to take it to the next level, and also not just the investment in terms of dollars, but also in terms of expertise. You've seen that over and over again, that founders can do an excellent job in taking it to a certain company size, but then struggle with topics like supply chain and scaling, which is not a bad reflection on their capabilities. It's just a natural kind of point that's hit where they need further support. There's also scenarios where in a public company setting, oftentimes, we found that certain public companies might be underappreciated, sort of lost a little bit in the FTSE 250, and maybe not covered as well by research analysts and misunderstood. And there's certain structural changes that need to occur. And some of those structural changes, to be fair, are more easily done, or can be more easily done outside of the public limelight and outside of having to report to your shareholders every quarter. And so I think that's where private equity can add as well. And then finally, I would argue that the governance model of private equity is the strongest, one of the strongest out there. We hold management teams and boards accountable for what they're doing, and we've shown that as an industry we can affect change in a pretty rapid way and modernize businesses for kind of what's ahead.
Right. So it's interesting because there's a sort of tension, isn't there, across financial services between the short term and the long term. And it always seems to me that PE is sort of able to have a longer term strategy and able to use private capital and being private to develop some really competitive strengths. And yet the big new thing in private equity is all about going public. So going back to the public markets. So isn't that a little weird? You know, that in the past, one of the great advantages was we could be longer term in our thinking and kind of dig in by being private. And now we're seeing IPOs of PE firms themselves. What's going on there?
I think, Margaret, there's an important distinction here. One is you're asking me about the private equity companies themselves and what is the right ownership model for them. The other is the companies that private equity companies own and are in their portfolio, and what's the right ownership model for that. And so I think those are two distinct points. If you're asking, you know, maybe taking your second question, why are private equity firms themselves deciding to go public?
Right.
It's part of that same growth journey. A lot of them started out as private partnerships. A lot of them started out as maybe founder-led, and you know, those founders are coming to an age or a point in their career where they need to think about succession and monetization, frankly. Right. And so to the extent that they may be held or holding the ownership in these private equity firms quite closely, sometimes the only way to monetize that or to, you know, do their own succession and estate planning is to either sell part of the GP, the general partner, to an outside shareholder, and or to take the general partner public. And I think that's what you're seeing. I think that doesn't change the underlying nature of the private equity firms, in that they will still invest in companies in a fund structure which you know, is more longer term focused, but it does certainly add a certain tension in the industry between kind of what the public markets value private equity as, and the private equity companies that are currently public. You could argue there is quite a focus by public shareholders on assets under management versus the gain or the carried interest that private equity firms realize, and what value they attribute to that outperformance in terms of on the deal level. So that's sort of the but that's again down to the public markets and how they value companies and how they value the private equity industry as a whole. And so you're seeing that dynamic play out.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it feels like a sort of coming of age of the industry, because so many people who really started the whole PE industry are now getting to a particular age, aren't they?
Yeah, and particularly in North America, you're seeing many founders in their late 70s, 80s still around. And so there needs to be some orderly succession planning. And I think that's what you're seeing happening.
Right. Yeah. Just one last question. I was very struck looking at the Advent website that there are a few more female faces on that website than I've seen in a lot of firms. Is that Advent, or is PE generally, do you think, a good place for women to be?
Look, I think the industry and financial services as a whole, I also want to end on a slightly more positive note. I know obviously Jane and Ali have had their experiences, but I've had nothing but positive experience as maybe, slightly younger female in this industry, starting out in investment banking on the front line in mergers and acquisitions. So even there in a sector, yes, that's still can be quite male dominated. I think I was, always welcome with open arms, and frankly, I think if as a woman you decide to go into financial services, you will have every opportunity you take. So I think I want to make that point in this forum as well. Financial service sector as a whole really wants to evolve, wants to see more women, and as a result is also very flexible in the career paths that they can offer. And similar to Ali's comment, I think from a qualification perspective, I think if you manage to do a number of years in banking or in accounting, whatever it might be, you set yourself up very strongly for anything else you want to do. If it's then going off into private equity or venture capital or running your own business, I think having a solid foundation in finance, I think, is really important. In terms of diversity and inclusion at Advent or private equity or financial service more broadly, it's at the top of everybody's agenda. What helps, I think, for Advent, we have a very globally diverse group to start off with. It's a little bit the comment Jane made around working with colleagues from all nationalities. So that's always a good starting point when you have 50 plus nationalities represented. But then also from a female perspective, I think we do a relatively good job on a global level. Actually, we have, I think, roughly 40-50% are female. That naturally takes everybody into account. If I just look at the deal team colleagues that the ones that are finding the companies and trying to make investments, it's still today, as of today, roughly 30% of our colleagues are female. So on the gender side, we're making good strides, but we're still way behind where the ambition should be, like everybody. But we have a lot of programs in place around, in particular, also sponsorship, which is different from mentorship. You're trying to bring female talent up the career ladder, giving them opportunities at the entry level. Naturally, we try at the minimum to start at 50-50. That's not always easy, given we feed from other financial service sectors. Usually the way into private equity, it's usually banking or consulting, but it can also be in smaller private equity firms. Accounting is oftentimes an entry sort of level qualification, but it's not that easy to get to the 50-50 at entry, but that's the target. And then the key, though, will also be the retention, because that's the other tricky thing as you start a family, as you have other priorities, or if it's elderly parents, whatever it might be. That's obviously a topic that's important for everybody, not just our female colleagues. And that's where I do think the culture overall is shifting. There's also a lot of young men in the team here who are starting to take parental leave and taking that not just for a few weeks, but for a number of months. And so I actually am very positive that the young men in our organization are the ones who are going to drive the change as a result of them also wanting more flexibilities. And I think the women will naturally benefit from that. So I see the whole topic a bit more positively maybe than the others.
But also, I think that comes back to a sort of theme here, which is that actually in this, men and women can and should be allies. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. I want to come to a question which one of our participants one of our audience has posted, because I think it comes to this. And I'll start with you first, Johanna, and then I'll come to Jane. The question comes from Helen Mace. How do you get the confidence to set boundaries as a female without the fear of being seen as not willing to be a team player or a hard worker? So given that, this financial services is a pretty hard charging environment, how do you get the confidence to put up and defend your own boundaries?
I think you just have to be confident in your own abilities ultimately, right? I think if you go into a certain area, you probably go into it because you think you can do a good job, and you'll get that feedback as part of your annual reviews if you're doing a good job. And I think then that confidence grows. And sometimes, if it comes to taking on another assignment, if it really overwhelms you, you need to say, look, I'm stretched. This is what I can do. This is what I can't do. Can you give me additional resource? I think just creating a level of confidence in yourself, being clear in your communication, but also being a team player. I think it is a very exciting industry. I think you're surrounded with a lot of very bright people, which is where you get your energy from, and from that teamwork and working with a lot of smart colleagues. And so I think having confidence in your own abilities to manage that and just going for it. And the same goes when you start having hopefully a family, and if that's something people want, sort of viewers on the line want to think about at some point. Same goes there. If you need to be at home at a certain point, you just leave on time. Just don't overthink it. Sometimes women overthink their careers. I think they already to decide at university not to do finance because they want to have a family and they think they can't combine a family with finance. But at that point, they still haven't even met their future husband. So my point is, don't overthink your life. Do one step at a time, and at least give it a go. Yeah,
Jane, what's your experience on this front?
Yeah, I think you need to be upfront. If there are things that you need in order to do your job more effectively, then you need to be upfront and honest. But I also think if you're stepping into a role, never assume that the way someone's done it before is the way you're going to do it. So I took on 2 other managing directors roles and did 3 jobs for 5 years and survived. And I did that because I found a good load of people to help me delegated quite a lot and gave them opportunity and found an innovative way of supporting the function. So, you know, I think like Johanna says, it's about being confident, having the confidence in your abilities, and then putting your case forward if it's not working for you. You know, I do think, however, that women can struggle on the return to work, especially if they're at senior level. So I think, you know, that's one of the other challenges is about, you know, how are you going to make that work and what's important to you. So, you know, it's quite important to have those discussions up front early, and don't just expect to come back to the same place you were if you haven't set that out initially. Although there's loads of rules and regulations around it, I think in reality you've got to be realistic about how the organisation continues without you, and how are you going to set it up for success while you're not there, and then when you come back, how's it going to work? So I think you know, I've had very senior women working for me on maternity leave, and they did such a good job delegating to their teams that when they came back, it was fine. They were able to just pick up where they left off, and everything worked really well. So I think it can be planned for.
Well, that dovetails very beautifully with another question that came from Linda Fletcher, who was very interested in your original comment about delegation. And she'd like to hear more about how you made sure you use this as a strategy.
I'm sure you can probably tell me the quote somewhere more than I can, Margaret, but you know, it's something about a leader's job isn't the leader's job to make themselves redundant.
Yes, exactly.
So the whole, you know, my premise was always to, you know, give people a lot of the work I had to do. And because I ended up taking 3 managing director jobs on, I had no choice but to delegate. And actually the team did such a great job at it. You know, I guess eventually they didn't need to keep me as I was. And that's partly why I've ended up sort of coming into a different world and portfolio career. So, you know, for me, I think it was a really great way of training people, a really great way of giving them opportunity. And it, you know, I think if you don't delegate properly, then you can't bring your team up, and you can't then step away. So the people I delegated to, you know, the most senior female is now doing my job, and she's doing it brilliantly. You know, and I put her in my succession plan, and she got the job. So, you know, and equally someone else that I did the same to, she's now running another organization in the same group. So, you know, I think if you help people and you delegate properly, then it sets them up for success over time. And it's a responsibility really of leadership, but you know, you have to do that. Otherwise, you know, don't be surprised that people then leave and find something else to do if they don't have enough interesting stuff to take on.
Exactly. I just have to ask you, because it strikes a chord with me when you say that you were doing 3 jobs. And I've definitely been in that situation myself. Were you getting 3 salaries?
No, but I did manage to get quite a good salary increase on the basis of that. And my bosses were quite surprised I had the balls to ask for it, to be honest.
Right.
I didn't get 3 salaries. I always thought I should have done, because I saved them 2 salaries. So actually, yeah, didn't work that way.
No, it's funny. It's only looking back, I can see there were times in my life where I definitely was doing 2 jobs for the price of 1. And I now think, why did I do that? And why did I actually not step forward and say, right, well, I'm doing this, which is a full-time job, and that's a full-time job. So how about you pay me for both of them? But we could all live our lives differently if we looked back. Ali, this point about delegation, how important is that, do you think, to a successful career?
Thank you. I was just unmuting myself. Well, I mean, having gone through the whole consulting route, you know, you have different stages. So you come in, the early years are really about getting technically up to, you know, reaching a certain standard. Then the second phase of your career is really around managing teams. And the last stage is really around sort of like, you know, going for partnership, where you are becoming a leader of the business, and that model would completely collapse, so you won't be able to scale to that level unless you're able to delegate. So your ability to progress within consulting is completely dependent on increasing levels of delegation, and that's what you go through. And you know, in many respects, I'm sort of like Johanna mentioned that she's you know, gone into private equity after having had these careers, and that's exactly it, whereby you go through your career pathway, and at the last stages, it's really, you enjoy the reflected glory of the people. And you know, my job in my current role is all about letting others do the job, and I just enjoy the you know, the reflected glory, and at other times you're just coaching people and telling them how to do things, imparting, which is essentially sort of like, my next 10, 15 years are all about exactly that. How do I build a legacy? And that's through other people, because time is now limited. It's about the influence that the leverage you're getting through other people.
Yeah.
Whilst I'm here, can I just say something on the boundaries thing?
Sure, please.
Which is, it's a friend of mine. I had somebody who's on a trading floor. She contacted me, Asian background, and she was very, very upset because she's a VP at one of the US American investment banks. And one of the chief traders had basically publicly shouted at her. So there are different types of boundaries. I know we've talked about work-life balance type of boundaries. I mean, that was quite sort of like, so she was quite shaken by that. And everybody on the floor observed it and nobody intervened. And again, the sense was that being of an Asian background, it was completely acceptable and she just had to be submissive and live with it. And so she said, like, what shall I do? Because it will be breaking, everybody was there. Nobody thought it was out of order, And my suggestion was, look, this shouldn't be happening in what was, 2 years ago, 2020. This shouldn't be happening now. And you should absolutely go to HR, say what's happened and just how upset you feel about it. And, and it's due credit to her. She found that courage and she went in. And later on, I asked, how was it? Because what HR immediately, you can imagine it's a US house. They're not going to let this one kind of thing pass away. So he was called in, HR was present, and she extracted an apology from him. And she said, when I was talking, she goes, I had to really hold back tears because I didn't want to let him know that and she goes, my heart was just sort of like beating so fast. And she said, but I'm so pleased I did it. Because I established that boundary. And I said, look, I respect you, you're my senior, but you will never, ever talk to me in that fashion. So I think those boundaries are so important because whether you're a minority or a female, you allow the boundaries to be crossed.
Right.
You have left the door open.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say we're living at a time where it's probably easier to assert that than it has been in the past. There's clearly a lot more to say on all these subjects, and I hope we can explore some of them in the next webinars that I'll be hosting through the year. Next month, I'll be addressing what the World Economic Forum has described as the single biggest and most urgent issue facing business today: sustainability and getting to carbon net zero. Last week, I wrote for the Financial Times about the fact that in the UK, 57% of chief executives do not think they have significant carbon emissions. So there's clearly a big job to be done to bring business up to speed. I hope you can join me for that. In the meantime, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our three wonderful panelists for sharing your work and your passion with us here today. Thank you so much, and goodbye.